Welcome everybody. Just having a few technical problems here. So welcome to the first session in a series by the Chinese Australian Historical Society entitled Talking Chinese Australian History. So it's the first in our series, so I hope you'll forgive any clumsiness or any errors that are going on. I'm just having to, like all of us, get used to this new technology. Excuse me. And so we're very happy. The idea of the series, of course, is to discuss Chinese Australian history with researchers, both academic and non-academic. So we're very pleased to have Dr. Karen Schamberger here as our first guest, and talking about Lambing Flat, particularly myths, memory, and history. Now, Lambing Flat, of course, is very suitable because it's something that people remember in the history. But also something that perhaps people remember in ways that isn't entirely able to stand up to historical scrutiny, which is, of course, very common with many things in the histories. So what we'll be doing then is discussing this with Dr. Karen Schamberger. Now, Dr. Karen Schamberger is an independent historian and curator. In 2017, she graduated from Deakin University with a PhD entitled Identity, Belonging and Cultural Diversity in Australian Museums. And in this very interesting thesis, she looked at 3 different objects in 3 different museums, including the roll-up No Chinese banner that's now in the Lambing Flat Folk Museum in Young. Karen's also worked in the National Museum of Australia in Canberra and at the Immigration Museum in Melbourne. And currently she's assisting the Lambing Flat Folk Museum with a new set of exhibition panels for the Gold Room, which will explain about the history of gold discovery, including the anti-Chinese riots and the contributions this all made to the community and town of Young. So today we're very happy to welcome Karen to discuss this area of expertise. It's a very interesting topic. And just to begin, Karen, I'd like to ask a very general question. Can you tell us a bit more about the background to Lambing Flat? How did all these people end up on this goldfield and causing riots? Over to you, Karen.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your very generous introduction. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I live on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and would like to extend this respect to any other Indigenous peoples who are joining us today. I think it's important to acknowledge that the place that we know variously as Barangong, Lambing Flat and Young are the traditional lands of the Barramundatory clan of the Wiradjuri nation, who continue to care for country to this day. By the late 1820s and 1830s, European squatters moved into the area, looking for places where they too could make a life for themselves. In 1826, Governor Darling defined the limits of location of the New South Wales colony as being no more than a strip of land you could see on this map. On this second slide here, coloured in pink. So this area that's just along the coast was the limits of the New South Wales colony. If you weren't able to buy land in this area, you moved outside of it and became a squatter. You left the protection of the British colony and had to fend for yourself, dealing with Indigenous peoples and also bushrangers. The movement of Europeans beyond the limits of location placed Aboriginal people in these areas and the land they relied upon under considerable pressure. Sometimes contact was violent, such as during the Bathurst War in 1824, which was between the Wiradjuri people to the north of Young around Bathurst and Britain as the colony of New South Wales expanded west of the Great Dividing Range. After this war, some of the remaining Wiradjuri people may have chosen to negotiate with the European squatters who continued to arrive on their lands so that they could remain as much as possible on country. This may explain the story of Coburn Jackie, who is reputed to have guided James White to a suitable place for a station along Barangong Creek. This story has been passed down through generations of the White family and has also been told to me by Wiradjuri elder Enid Clark. Coburn Jackie and other members of the Wiradjuri nation continued to live on country and practice their culture, as well as work for various squatters on their runs. They were excellent cattlemen. The discovery of gold at Barangong in 1860 changed the landscape irrevocably as well as the lives of everyone who depended on it. The New South Wales gold rush began in 1850 with the first publicised discovery of gold at Bathurst. This was followed by the Victorian gold rush from 1851. People from all over the world migrated to Victorian colonies and New South Wales, including Chinese people. Interracial demonstrations and conflict arose at Bendigo in 1854, Rocky River in 1856, the Buckland River in 1857, and on the Turon in 1858. The colony of Victoria enacted the first Chinese Immigration Act in 1855, which imposed a £10 tax on every Chinese arrival and limited the numbers of Chinese people on each ship to one person for every 10 tonnes. The New South Wales Legislative Council rejected a bill in 1858 to restrict the number of Chinese immigrants to the colony. There were businessmen and merchants in the colony who wanted international and particularly Chinese trade, as well as Chinese labour. And there were people in Parliament whose liberal views required Chinese exclusion. That is, they thought you couldn't have a colony of free and equal men with an underclass of Chinese labourers. And this parliamentary disagreement would spill out over the goldfields of Barangong.
Oh, well, Karen, that's thank you for that very thorough backgrounding. So when exactly was gold discovered, and how did it then develop into what we now know as the Lambing Flat Riots?
Okay, well, in March or in July 1860, depending on which source you use, an African-American cook, Alexander the Yankee, discovered gold in a paddock for lambing ewes, which led to the beginning of the gold rush. Michael Sheedy reported the gold find to the government in August, and the rush to Barangong began. It was reputed to be a poor man's field, which meant that it was primarily alluvial gold, with shallow sinkings of around 3 to 50 feet. By mid-October, there were 500 Chinese and about 1,200 Europeans on the field. The first anti-Chinese riots occurred on the 13th of November, when 500 Chinese were driven off the diggings. After the area was officially proclaimed a goldfield on the 27th of November, Gold Sub-Commissioner David Dixon and 2 mounted policemen were provided with temporary lodging at James Roberts Station at Currawong, 12 miles from the flat. Anti-Chinese riots continued through December, January and February until March, when Premier Cowper and the 12th Regiment of the British Army arrived at Barangong to listen to the European miners' concerns and to secure the field. Premier Cowper promised the miners that he would act to limit Chinese immigration, but in the meantime, he reinforced the Gold Commissioner's decision to segregate the Chinese to Blackguard Gully. In April, the New South Wales imposed the name of Young and began to sell land under this place name. The 12th Regiment left the field in May 1861, shortly after the New South Wales Parliament failed to pass a bill to limit Chinese immigration. Then between the 21st and 23rd of May, there are violent clashes between Chinese and Europeans at Native Dog Creek, which is near Bathurst, as the Chinese begin to assert their rights to land. Then in mid-June, there are newspaper reports of about 1,500 Chinese landing in Sydney who are headed for Lambing Flat. And this sets the scene for the most violent anti-Chinese riot on the 30th of June and the attack on the police camp and Gold Commissioner's camp on the 14th of July. The 12th Regiment returned to Barangong a second time to secure the field at the end of July. In November 1861, the New South Wales Parliament passed the Chinese Immigrants Regulation and Restriction Act, which imposed a £10 tax on Chinese immigrants arriving by ship, and the Goldfields Act, which enabled the restriction of aliens aimed at Chinese people to only be able to mine in certain areas. This effectively meant that the Chinese could only mine areas which European miners had already abandoned. The riots also led to the 1862 Police Regulation Act, which formalised the creation of the New South Wales Police Force. There are also a number of petitions to the New South Wales government for compensation compiled by the Chinese miners and storekeepers, which can help us understand what happened to them from their perspective. I want to acknowledge that Juanita Kwok has also been examining these petitions, and my account here has been informed by conversations with her. Ely Finch has looked at some of the documents which include Chinese character names of the petitioners and has noted that there appear to be at least 2, possibly 3, different groups of Chinese people. Speakers of Siip are Hokkien-related vernacular and possibly Hakka, but this is not yet confirmed. This accords with newspaper reports stating that there are 3 different groups of Chinese at Back Creek and conflicts between 2 different groups of Chinese at Wombat, both locations on the Barangong goldfield. So I've used quotes from some of these documents on the following slides. The first group of petitions are those relating to the January and February 1861 riots. According to William Campbell, who investigated the petitions, there were 30 claimants for compensation for a total of £6,339, such as this one from Su San Ling Do. He had a miner's right from the Snowy River or the Cayandra goldfields and was driven off Lambing Flat on the 27th of January. His tent and possessions to the value of £300 were destroyed. William Campbell asked Mr. Walker, who had apparently sold Su San Ling Do some of his goods. William Campbell asked Mr. Walker about these claimed goods, but received the answer that Mr. Walker had never heard of Su San Ling Do. Campbell also dismissed an eyewitness account that Su San Ling Do's tent was burnt down during the 19th of February riot, because this was inconsistent with the original petition relating to losses sustained in January. Campbell declared that the destruction of property during the January and February riots was very trifling, and that the claims herein before referred to are altogether fraudulent.
Oh dear, that's a very disappointing result for him. So that's a fascinating amount of detail there, Karen. So what exactly did the Europeans want then, and then how did the Chinese respond to these attacks?
Okay, well, the Europeans were quite desperate by this time. They had been on the Cayandra goldfield, which was a very difficult goldfield to work. So they were desperate to make a living for themselves. Well, actually, everyone was desperate to make a living for themselves. So it was a pretty tense time, and the Europeans formed the Miners' Protective League at the end of January to pursue their cause. They demanded the following: the expulsion of the Chinese from the goldfields, to effect which the League call upon men of all nations to join them. Then followed demands for police protection, repeal of the gold duty, unlocking the lands, promulgation of the word of God, protection of native industry, and increased representation of the mining interest. Now, the Chinese do respond to these attacks in a number of different ways. So on the 19th of February, they are described as fighting back against the Europeans who attacked them at Blackguard Gully. And the next day, on the 20th of February, Kian Ku places an advertisement in the local newspaper, the Miner and General Advertiser, asking his countrymen to contribute to a stew for Gold Commissioner David Dixon to thank him for, and I quote, his humanity during the late outrages, as you can see on the left of this slide. Next to this advertisement, I've quoted from the petition of Hufu and Kai Long and a number of other Chinese miners, which notes that they had purchased the appropriate government licenses to be able to work as miners or storekeepers, and which they believed entitled them to the quiet enjoyment of personal property, but also to some extent to a temporary interest in the soil, and that so great an imperfection cannot exist in the British law as to not provide for violence and outrage committed against such recognised rights. One of the principal maxims of the British Constitution being that there is no injury without a remedy. So they are appealing here to British law directly citing the Riot Act of the British Parliament through the description of an armed band of European and other diggers who did riotously and tumultuously assemble. And they consider themselves alongside Europeans in how they are entitled to land in order to extract value from it.
Well, that's, thanks, Karen. That certainly gives us a lot of food for thought there. Another question then is, so you use terms, or terms you often hear terms used, such as riot and affray, and some people even use the term massacre. So why are these different terms being used for these events?
Okay, well, I'd like to clarify these different terms and then step through how they can be used, or how they could be used. Mm-hmm. Riot is an offence relating to the disturbance of the peace and public order. The Riot Act, which was read on the 27th of January and the 14th of July 1861, was the Riot Act 1714, which was an act of the Parliament of Great Britain. This Act authorised local officials to make a proclamation ordering the dispersal of a group of 12 or more persons who were unlawfully, riotously and tumultuously gathered together. If the group failed to disperse within an hour, anyone who remaining could be charged with a felony. Affray is another legal term which is commonly used for these events. In English common law, an affray is a public disorder offence involving the fighting of one or more people in a public space. Newspapers reported 2 Chinese deaths in the December 1860 riot. The superintendent of the mounted police, Henry Zouch, investigated these claims and found that the reports had originated with the European miners. The Chinese reported no deaths to him. So it's possible that the reports of 2 Chinese deaths was a rumour started by the European miners with the intent to scare Chinese miners away. A number of the Chinese petitions, such as this one from Hu Fu and Kai Long, directly cite the definition of riot from the Riot Act in their claims for compensation. So we can safely describe what happened between the 17th of November 1860 and the 14th of July 1861 as a series of riots or affray, which become increasingly violent, culminating in the worst anti-Chinese riot on the 30th of June. Now I've quoted another petition from Ah Su, and he also cites the Riot Act. This concerns his treatment on the 30th of June, which was brutal, and he had some of the flesh torn from his skull as his queue was cut off. The queue is his hair that is tied up in like a ponytail. We know from the US context that having flesh torn from one's scalp or a scalping is not usually fatal, and Ah Su's petition is a testament to that fact. But we can't discount the possibility of death following serious injury for other people involved in the riots. According to the Miner and General Advertiser, at least 6 Chinese at Back Creek were severely injured. We know that one of their countrymen in Adelong paid the passage home for about 6 of the injured. By the 7th of August, there are reports of around 500 Chinese mining again at Back Creek, so a significant number of them do return to the field. During the September trials of the rioters, of the people who were attacking the Chinese, James McCulloch Henley, one of the translators, claimed that 3 Chinese people died during the 30th of June riot, and a 4th later died of his injuries on the Turon goldfield. His reason for making this claim was that he could not account for this number of Chinese miners and thought they must have been murdered. He was accused and then cleared of perjury, but his reputation never recovered. His report was never officially investigated, and it isn't possible to now prove or disprove his claim. So we can state that there were possibly 4 deaths due to the 30th of June riot, although these are unconfirmed. However, does this make what happened a massacre? I think there needs to be more research and thinking around the subject of anti-Chinese riots from the perspective of the discipline of massacre studies. Lyndall Ryan, who is mapping massacres of the Aboriginal people around Australia, looked to the work of the French sociologist Jacques Semelin, who, after the Srebrenica massacre in 1995, defined a massacre as the indiscriminate killing of innocent, unarmed people over a limited period of time. Massacres were carefully planned and deliberately shrouded in secrecy by the systematic disposal of bodies and intimidation of witnesses. His definition enabled Ryan to consider her own scholarship on the Tasmanian War. Her definition of a massacre for her mapping project is the indiscriminate killing of 6 or more undefended people. Her reasoning is as follows. Since Aboriginal communities tended to live together in camps of about 20 people, losing 6 or more people in one killing usually led to the whole community collapsing. This points to a way forward for those of us who research Chinese Australian history. What were the social structures of Chinese people on the goldfields, and how would multiple deaths in a short space of time have been experienced by these communities? At what point would these communities collapse? We can also compare massacres of the Chinese in North America during the 19th century, such as at Rock Springs in Wyoming in 1885, where at least 28 Chinese were killed and 15 injured. We can also compare it to the massacre at Hell's Canyon in Oregon in 1887, where 13 Chinese were killed. And this can build on the work of Andrew Marcus, who compared anti-Chinese riots in Australia and California. Sorry. I think it's important for us to think carefully about the use of the term massacre, because as Sophie Couchman has stated, the discipline of Chinese Australian history may in future face demands of evidence around the various claims made about anti-Chinese violence. I've also noticed that in concentrating on the violence and massacre idea, it has resulted in less attention being paid to the efforts of Chinese miners to seek compensation for damage to property. William Campbell examined 1,568 claims for damages incurred during this riot on the 30th of June, totaling £40,000. He struggled to find witnesses, had trouble with translations, couldn't always identify the claimants, and thought a number of claims were fraudulent. So he recommended that about £4,200 be paid to 706 individuals. We know that in 1864, a number of them are still chasing this money, and Juanita Kwok is researching the Chinese petition from China, which continues to pursue these claims.
Well, that's certainly very thought-provoking research there, Karen, both about the deaths and also the compensation claims. So in general, why do you think it's so hard for people to understand what happened at Lambing Flat, and why, for example, are there so many varying accounts?
I think that some of the difficulties arise in understanding these events because eyewitnesses may not see everything that happens due to their location, so their reports are conflicting. Their view may be partially blocked, or the angle they are viewing from skews their perspective. They also may make assumptions based on what they have seen, based on their personal perspectives, experiences, or hearsay. Sources from the time of the riots also have biases based on political positioning and the motivations for providing accounts of particular incidents and the riots more broadly. On this slide is an example of the differing accounts surrounding one incident which happened to Simon Sandling and his Irish-born wife, Marcella Madigan, during the 30th of June riot. In the centre of this slide, I've quoted from Simon Sandling's petition for compensation, which details his experience. He and Marcella fled their tent with their family. Simon was beaten, robbed, and their tents and possessions burnt. The police provided no assistance, and authorities on the field were unable or unwilling to satisfy his pleas for compensation. Now, I'm
sure Karen's back. There you go.
Yes, I am back. Okay, sorry about that.
Okay.
In the Sydney Morning Herald newspaper clipping, which you'll see to the top left of your screen, we have an eyewitness account from the translator James McCulloch Henley. Henley was mostly sympathetic to the Chinese, as he was paid a retainer as a translator for them, for the Chinese, and the Sydney Morning Herald was supportive of Chinese immigration. In Henley's account, he reports that a European woman with 3 small children, who is the wife of a Chinaman, was sitting in her tent rocking her baby in the cradle. The lawless mob burnt down her tent and the cradle wherein the infant was sleeping. In the next newspaper clipping, below the first, from the Empire newspaper, which advocated for the limitation of Chinese immigration, it notes that the report of the tent burning with the infant inside, was a wicked and deliberate falsehood, and that the mother of the infant stated that the family was not molested. On the slide to the right of Simon Sandling's account, I've quoted a section of William Campbell's investigation into this claim for compensation, and he quotes Marcella stating that she was not in the tent when the mob were there, and that she was not molested. She also said that her tent was burnt, but her infant was not inside. There is no testimony reported from Marcella about her husband's treatment. So when you're reading accounts of the riots, and I encourage people to do so, it's essential to compare as many sources as possible to be able to gain a fuller picture of what happened, and to consider the limitations and biases of these accounts.
All right. Oh, well, thank you for that. That's some excellent research there, and some interesting juxtaposition of information. So, can I ask, what got you interested in researching the Lambing Flat Riots in the first place? Where did it all start?
Well, a number of years ago, as a young museum curator, I was interested in migration and cultural diversity. I came across the roll-up banner as part of research for another exhibition that I was working on. And the banner is on display at the Lambing Flat Folk Museum in Young. And it's a pretty notorious object. A short time later, I had a conversation with a Chinese Australian who told me that there were no Chinese accounts of the riots. So when I finally got round to doing a PhD, I chose to study the banner as one of my case studies, in part so that I could find out if there were any Chinese accounts. And here I've placed a quote from the petition of Tom Mee, Wat Young, and Q next to the banner, because I think it's useful to understand how significant the banner is to both anti-Chinese European perspectives, plus also the Chinese miners' perspective. These men use the banner as evidence of their treatment in the hope that it will gain them compensation. So that basically the object itself is a testament to what they experienced on the 30th of June.
Right. So that's a great count so far of what was happening in Lambing Flat back in the 1860s. But so how do you think the riots have been remembered? And what did you find out from your studies of the banner, for example?
Okay. Well, I found that a number of accounts from the time of the riots treat the Chinese as being active participants, in some of the riots. Accounts from the time vary. Some are quite ashamed of the treatment of the Chinese. Others are quite critical of the government for not stepping in. Samuel Gill's painting of an anti-Chinese riot from 1862 gives the Chinese miners agency through their forward momentum. The Europeans also have agency through the pulling of a miners' queue. However, there was also considerable shame. Between 1862 and 1900, reports the riots were purposely omitted from official accounts of New South Wales history. All the events were willfully distorted to portray Premier Cowper's visit to Lambing Flat in March 1861 as being sufficient to calm the Europeans. From the 1880s onwards, popular memories of the Lambing Flat riots are revived in the context of renewed anti-Chinese sentiment, which comes about due to fears around cheap Chinese furniture labourers and crews on steamships. In the lead up to Federation, the riots become narrated as being the birth of white Australia, which takes Chinese agency away. So in the first illustration on the left, the Chinese appear as passive victims during the riots. It's also around this time when the idea of massacres of Chinese are introduced. Narratives also sometimes shift the emphasis of the riots onto the 14th of July riot, which is between European miners and the police, similar to Eureka, because it gives the incident a little bit more legitimacy, in that it's a fight against authority rather than other people. The fullest account of the foundation myth that the Lambing Flat riots are the birth of white Australia is the film from 1928, The Birth of White Australia, made and financed in Young. It begins with the landing of Captain Cook at Botany Bay in 1770 and ends with the opening of the Federal Parliament House in Canberra in 1927. The film provides a foundation narrative for the nation where Aboriginal people, represented as being peacefully subdued, and then Chinese invaders are fought and defeated at Lambing Flat to enable the white Australian nation to be born. The film emphasises the introduction of the Chinese Immigrants Regulation and Restriction Act 1861, directly leading to the White Australia policy, which consisted of the Immigration Restriction Act and the Pacific Island Labourers Act of 1901. Narrating the riots as the birth of white Australia erases the agency of Chinese miners and storekeepers in the face of racial violence, and erases their continuing presence at Barangong, the colony of New South Wales and the Australian nation. It simplifies the legislative history involved and also does not enable those of us who have Chinese heritage and are alive today to face up to the active role that people of Chinese descent had and continue to have in the colonisation of this continent.
Right, very interesting, Karen, and I think very well put that. So, can I ask? So, what are you researching now? What's your current field of endeavour?
Okay, I'm continuing to do a bit more research on the Lambing Flat riots for the Lambing Flat Folk Museum, where I'm doing a bit of volunteer work there. And I also have an academic interest in analysing the effect of the Goldfields Act when it was in force between 1861 and 1866, as well as the Chinese Immigrants Regulation and Restriction Act, which was repealed in 1867. Tensions continued to simmer and break out into violence periodically on the Barangong goldfields. So, for instance, on Monday, the 22nd of August, 1864, there is a Chinese roll-up where the European miners are attacked. The cause of this riot is given by the Chinese as the inconsistent application of the Goldfields Act. Sometimes a magistrate would let them mine in one area, only to fine them the next day. but then a few days later, they would be allowed to mine in the same area again. After their arrest, a number of Chinese miners refused to pay the £5 fine for mining over the boundary of the place they were confined to, and state that the government can pay for their food and lodging in jail with the proceeds of the £10 poll tax they had paid upon immigration to the colony. So I'm interested in the practical application of the legislation and what kinds of issues arise from it, including Chinese perspectives wherever possible.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you very much for that, Karen. And that's, I think, a very thorough and interesting discussion there. I can see you've got some further readings there for people. And I think now we'll try and open up the chat. We've got quite a number of people here online, and some of them have already put some questions down. Take this opportunity to ask any more questions if you wish. So I might take the opportunity just to ask my question first, Karen, if that's okay, just to get in quick. So what do you say to those who insist on continuing to describe Lambing Flat as a massacre? I know you've touched on this a little bit before, but perhaps you'd like to expound upon that a little.
I think that people who do that need to be honest about what their motivations are, as to why they want to describe the riots as a massacre. I think that we need to be very cautious in talking about these events because we need to be able to provide evidence. If you have evidence, then by all means you can say what you like. But if you stick to the historical sources, then we really need to think about why are you trying to make these events out to be a massacre. And that will be a political question as well as a cultural one. So it does play into the mythology around the riots being the birth of white Australia, in the sense that Aboriginal people are also supposedly killed off and made extinct, according to the mythology in the film The Birth of White Australia. So you're basically putting Chinese people into the same position. And I think that is really difficult because that does not let us acknowledge that Chinese people in Australia are also colonisers. And we also have an impact on the destruction of this country and the lives of Aboriginal people as they knew it. So I think Chinese Australians also need to start thinking about how they are sandwiched in between Europeans and Aboriginal people, and how that means that they do face racism as well, but they also impact on Aboriginal people in racist ways. And I think we need to think more carefully about how we do that. And I think the massacre idea doesn't help us do that.
Very good. All right, so I'll ask another question from the chat. This is from Kaz. She asks, I've got a question. How did the Chinese miners know about the British laws?
Well, they would have known because some of them were translators. So the first petition that I showed was from Su Sanling Do. He and his brother Simon Sanling had some English language. So Su Sanling Do's petition was in English. So they were able to understand the Riot Act when it was read. There is also the matter of having access to other translators and lawyers. So many of the petitions from the 30th of June were written in Sydney by various lawyers. James McCulloch Henley was one of the translators. Some of the February petitions were written by other lawyers in Sydney. So there would have been some sort of familiarity there.
Right. Yes, I don't doubt that. We know that the Chinese community was quite up on quite a lot of things from various contacts they had. All right, we've got a few more questions here, quite a number here. I'll just try and pick some out. Some of them you answered. I think they asked the questions a bit too early. All right, I've got one here from Ely. How many accounts of the events are there in any language that can be described as Chinese accounts? There's a
That's
total
very general.
account.
I have only found the petitions and the advertisement in the newspaper. I haven't really delved into any of the Chinese newspapers, whether there's any memories from those earlier times. So that's the only thing that I've really come across. It doesn't mean there's nothing out there. There might be something.
Yes, well, it might be. Actually, there's another one here from that's asking, do you research any of Chinese, let's say Chinese language books that talk about this history? So another aspect of Chinese accounts, I assume she's referring to modern Chinese scholars.
That would be wonderful, but I have a language issue. I'm pretty much monolingual. So even though I have Chinese heritage myself, I was a very bad young person and didn't learn Mandarin properly. And I didn't learn Cantonese either.
Yes, there's always a problem for researchers, and whether we're looking at modern or older historical accounts.
I don't have it.
Okay, here's another question from Carol. Are there any Aboriginal accounts of this event that you've looked at? Also, you did mention talking to some elders, but...
I have spoken to one elder, and they have no oral histories, but that doesn't mean that other Aboriginal people don't. I've only spoken to one elder so far, and I'm looking to speak to more. It's also possible that there may be elders in other communities who may know something, because if the Chinese are leaving Lambing Flat, they're moving through other parts of the country. They're going out to Bathurst, they're going out to Adelong, they're going out to Yass. So it may be that there are communities in those areas that know something.
Right, well, that would be quite interesting to discover a bit more. Another question here, I haven't got a name. It just says, what do you think about the tourist-related annual events in Yarn standing on the Lambing Flat incidents?
I think they have changed over the years. So when I completed my PhD, I looked at the Lambing Flat Folk Festival in 2014, which had a particular Chinese theme that year, and they also did have a reenactment of the 30th of June riot with a replica roll up no Chinese banner. For me, seeing that reenactment was actually very distressing, because the Chinese who were portraying the miners in that event were pretty much left with no agency whatsoever, in the sense that they were chased away. And it wasn't shown that they could fight back or had any kind of way of being able to speak back to what happened to them. And this was held in amongst a festival that celebrated Chinese culture. So there was Chinese opera, there was also musical performances, there was martial arts, and there were lion dances. And there was also school performances related to understanding the riots. So it was quite a strange mix. And I know they don't do the riot reenactment anymore, because I had sent them what I thought about it. The council, what I had thought about it. And I know they don't do that anymore. But they do have a Chinese festival that does celebrate Chinese culture, but it hasn't moved very deeply into the local Chinese community, and it hasn't yet, I think, developed a way of understanding what life was like for Chinese Australians who continued to live in Young. That hasn't come through as much. So the festival itself still needs a bit of work to make it both relevant to a local community, and also there needs to be some thinking, I think, around whether it needs to be a Chinese festival, or whether it's actually a better thing for Young to move towards having a more multicultural festival where they can celebrate the cultural diversity of all of the people that came to Young. So there's a significant Lebanese community, there are Croatians, there are Germans, there are Irish people. I mean, there's also an option of celebrating all of those cultures. And maybe in that process, there's actually a way of bringing out local stories and celebrating the local, I guess, migrant communities that way.
Right, right. Yeah, I understand. And so leading on to that, we've got a question here from Juanita, who's asked, so what kind of work are you doing at the museum now? And if you had no budgetary restrictions, which is always, of course, a dream, what would you like to see there? Obviously, you know, specifically looking at your museum and your area of expertise there.
Okay, well, I've been asking lots of questions and trying to visit as many of the sites as I possibly can. The volunteers at the museum have been very kind and have been telling me all the local stories that they know, telling me who I should talk to. So I've started to talk to people outside the museum. And people have been very generous with their time and expertise. So what I'm thinking for this new exhibition is to try and concentrate on the local stories. So at the moment, the exhibition panels are a little bit more focused on Victorian gold rushes and a gold rush history that's very general. But I'm looking to make it more specific to the Barangong goldfield. If I had no budgetary restraints whatsoever, I would be using a lot more multimedia. And I would love to be able to make a touch screen with a database of all of the people we know who were on the goldfields. So there is anti-Chinese petitions from the Europeans. There are also the petitions and claims for compensation from the Chinese. And what I would really love to do is be able to enable visitors to see a name and try to find out a bit more information about them. So it would be a database of people. Mm-hmm. Because I sometimes feel that the riots are narrated in a way that takes people out of the picture.
Yes, that's often the trouble with history, isn't it? You're looking at things from a top-down point of view. And that brings us to another question. It's an interesting question. It's very specific, and that might help you to do this a little bit. There's a Craig here asks, have you learned anything about the band that played during the attack on Blackguard's Gully?
Yes, the German band.
German band.
Well, it is a German band.
Multicultural.
Very multicultural.
Right.
Actually, 3 of the band members are trialled for their part in the 30th of June riot. None of them are ever jailed or punished for their part, but yes, there is a band. I don't yet know if anything remains from that band, whether we can find instruments or anything more about them yet. I haven't got to that point, but that's a really good question. Thank you.
It's a very interesting question. We have a question here now from Sandy. And so Sandy's asks, did you come across any other women's accounts on the riot apart from the one wife, Marcella, that you mentioned? And was she the only wife of a Chinese mentioned in the official accounts, or to your knowledge, I guess?
She's the only one that I've found words from, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. I have also found the descriptions of the riots where the European women are involved in attacking the Chinese, which is an interesting thing. It's not just males.
In Lambing Flat.
At Lambing Flat, yeah. There are no Chinese women as far as we know on Lambing Flat though. So yes, the women's story is something else to be researching.
All right, now we have one here referring back to the A4 exhibition on the Lambing Flat Riots, which I know you were involved in a few years ago. And the question is, in that exhibition there was an account of a farmer who helped the Chinese diggers, giving them sanctuary successfully. Do you have any comments about that part of the story?
Yes, James Roberts did give sanctuary to the Chinese after the 30th of June riot on his property at Karawong. He was also asked to do so by the Commissioner and George O'Malley Clark. I think that it's something that needs to be acknowledged, definitely. But I left it out of my account this time round because I wanted to focus principally on the Chinese perspectives. And I think that to tell the story holistically, we do need to acknowledge his role and the fact that he had to pursue compensation up until about 1887, I think, before he was paid the whole amount that he claimed. But I also don't think that his story should be told to the detriment of the Chinese perspective. I also think that the Chinese agency in this story needs to be foregrounded more.
Right. So another question that I'll ask is about the Chinese. So do you know of many that stayed in the community after the riots, that are there descendants of people who were involved from that period of time, in Young or in the district?
Yes, Simon Sandling, whose petition I showed you earlier, we know that in 1862 he becomes a translator on the southern goldfields, so around Tumut and Adelong. So he stays in the area and continues to be a translator. And there's a report in 1880 that he's writing a letter to an editor of a local paper, commenting on a local politician's anti-Chinese comments. So it's quite interesting that he continues his activism in a way. Mm-hmm. And he dies in Wagga Wagga at the age of 80 in 1939. So he's there. And of course, his children are born in Australia. So it's possible that his descendants are around in our community somewhere. And I know that Juanita Kwok has also found someone who lives in Bathurst who possibly is descendant from one of the other claimants for compensation.
Right.
We've found so far.
Right, that's fascinating. All right, I think we're beginning to round it up now. Can I just ask then one more question, just to perhaps we'll finish it off there, unless there's any others come through on the chat. We've got a few questions there, but some of them are a bit long and technical and not very good for this format, so perhaps we'll save those and you can perhaps answer them later on. So the final question is then, these riots and affrays that were on the Lambing Flat, how do they compare to the kinds of riots and affrays that were going on, or conflicts that were going on in other goldfields around Australia at the time, either or a little bit before and after? Is Lambing Flat particularly significant in comparison?
I think Lambing Flat is particularly significant because of the length of the riots. It goes from November 1860 to July 1861, which are the longest riots in Australia, really, anti-Chinese riots. They're also significant because of the legislation that comes after them. So the 3 acts of Parliament that I mentioned, the Goldfield Regulation Act, the Chinese Immigration Act, and the Police Regulations Act, and the founding of the New South Wales Police Force. I also think that they are particularly violent. So the Buckland River riot is probably the only other one where we know people have been killed. And there it is known that 3 people were killed, but it's not known if there were more, because miners during that riot were chased by people on horseback into the freezing river. So it's possible that others have drowned. So I think that's probably the other one to compare it to. But I think Lambing Flat definitely has a legislative impact that's important. And it also is important to our cultural imagination. Right.
All right, that's fascinating. All right, Karen, I think we'll finish there. We've gone for a good hour now. Well, I also want to say thank you very much for a fascinating and interesting talk, and I hope to ask you that perhaps we'll have you come back again and talk in more detail, because obviously there's never an end to history, and there's always more information that we can talk about and discuss, and other perspectives to look at, as well as looking at to perhaps have you on, and perhaps we'll do a round table with other historians as well to talk about other aspects of the history. You mentioned the word agency many times, and I think that's a very important concept that we should talk about. a little bit more. So just for now, I'd like to say thank you very much and welcome back at another time.
Okay, thank you. And if you do have questions, feel free to send them through to the Chinese Australian Historical Society, and they'll pass them on to me, and I'll endeavour to answer them as well. Or you can track me down on social media.
All right. Thank you very much, Karen.
Thank
And
you.
see you again. All right. Goodbye.
Bye.